A little while ago, I compiled my top 10 greatest English medieval monarchs. Since then, thanks to a significant increase in research, my opinions have changed quite dramatically, and so I have decided to rank each English king from worst to best, beginning from Alfred the Great, who became King of Wessex in 871, to Richard III, who died in 1485. You may find some of my decision making quite controversial, so do feel free to leave a comment in the section below. At number 34, in last position, King John. A malicious, petty, and at times a cruel man, King John's reign was a total disaster, and was most notable for Magna Carta, which was in itself a damning indictment on John. John thoroughly deserves his place as England's worst medieval king. At number 33, Athelred the Unready. Athelred could easily have been ranked as the worst medieval king England ever had, save for two mitigating factors. Athelred had the throne forced upon him in 978 when he was aged about 12, after the murder of his half brother, Edward the Martyr. Athelred was extremely reluctant to take the crown, and for this deserves some sympathy. His reign also coincided with an upsurge in Viking raids on England, and would have been a challenging time for kings far more capable than Athelred. He's not quite the worst, but not far off. At 32, Henry VI. One of the kings who was at the heart of the Wars of the Roses. Henry was a gentle, kindly man, quite unlike most medieval kings. Some attribute his lack of kingly qualities to the fact his father, Henry V, died when he was only a baby, leaving him with no role model to look up to. But I rather suspect Henry's nature wouldn't have differed all that much had Henry V lived longer. At 31, Harold Harefoot. A largely forgettable reign, Harold, a son of Canute, is best remembered for his unusual nickname, stealing the throne off his brother Arthur Canute, and for being responsible for, with the help of Earl Godwin, the brutal attack on Alfred, the brother of Edward the Confessor. At 30, Eadwig. A short-lived and little-known king, Eadwig reigned from 955 to 959. He has been condemned as a highly unpopular king by many, but whether that's fair for a ruler who was still only a teenager when he died is questionable. At 29, Edward the Martyr. Edward was murdered by his own stepmother in 978, who wanted her son, Athelred, to become king. As a result, it's hard to draw any conclusions on Edward's short reign, but it's hard to see how he could have done any worse than Athelred. At 28, Edward V. Another tragic young king who fell victim to the machinations of a greedy close relative. The fate of Edward V remains one of history's most discussed topics even today. It can only be speculated what sort of king Edward would have made had his dastardly uncle not taken the crown. But from the little glimpses that we get of Edward, it seems he had a wise head on his young shoulders. At 27, Arthur Canute. After his usurping brother, Harold Harefoot, died in 1040, Arthur Canute got his revenge at last by digging Harold up, beheaded the corpse, and chucked it in a bog. However, like Harold, Arthur Canute would leave no lasting impression, and died after reigning over England for only 2 years. 26. Svein Forkbeard. The father of Canute, Svein briefly deposed Athelred the Unready in late 1013, but was only King of England for a matter of weeks, as Svein died soon after. From an English point of view, Svein had been nothing but a menace for years. For the Danes, he had laid the groundwork for a conquest of England. At 25, Harold II Godwinson, the man best remembered for being defeated and killed at Hastings, Harold was the last king of Anglo-Saxon England. Had the Battle of Hastings turned out differently, which it easily could have done, all the signs indicated that Harold would have made a very fine king indeed. As it was, his reign lasted just 9 months. At 24, Richard III. Whilst the circumstances around Richard's becoming king are, at best, controversial, there is little doubt that Richard did have the qualities, or at least some of the qualities, of a fine king, if you conveniently ignore his treachery for a moment, and he certainly ranks higher than some of the other kings I have already mentioned on this list. At 23, Edward II. Edward is only as high up as he is due to the fact that the previous kings listed all had either short reigns or were just completely hopeless. Edward wasn't completely hopeless, but he was a bad king. Militarily wise, he was next to useless, as evidenced by his dismal defeat at Bannockburn in 1314. He also pissed off his entire nobility by favouring men like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser the Younger over actually governing his country. Alright, maybe Edward II was completely hopeless. At 22, we have Richard II. Like Edward II, Richard was deposed. Also, like Edward II, Richard had a tendency to favour those he shouldn't, and make enemies out of dangerous men. Though he could be spiteful and malicious, particularly to those who sought to control his royal power, Richard could also be a kind and likeable man. While certainly not a good king, Richard was also not the tyrant he is often made out to be. At 21, Stephen. Stephen showed in 1135 that he was an opportunistic man, as he stole the crown of England off his cousin, the Empress Matilda. His reign, however, was a near disaster, as it was dogged by civil war. Stephen, however, was not without his good points. He was a brave soldier and a kind man. It was his mercy that spared the life of the young William Marshal, an act that the English crown would be hugely thankful for in the decades following Stephen's death in 1154. 20. Henry III. England's longest reigning medieval king, Henry was even worse at handling finances than his father, King John, had been. Henry blew money on promised crusades that he never actually went on, trying to put his son, Edmund Crouchback, on the throne of Sicily, and doing a ridiculous amount of building work. Henry's most famous work was Westminster Abbey, in honour of his idol, Edward the Confessor. At 19, we have Henry IV. Henry deposed his cousin, Richard II, in 1399 and endured a torturous reign thereafter, as rebellions plagued him, most famously from Harry Hotspur and Owen Glyndŵr. Henry clung on to power, but he began to suffer from increasingly poor health, possibly leprosy, and his son, Henry of Monmouth, the future Henry V, began to dominate his government. 18. Edred. Another king who suffered from ill health, Edred, who reigned from 946 to 955, oversaw the retaking of Northumbria, which had repeatedly refused to be united under the English crown. This was the permanent completion of the unification of England, and Edred's role in the country's history, while seemingly minor to some, shouldn't be underestimated. 17. Edward IV. Edward IV is arguably the greatest general in English medieval history. His track record in battle was second to none. However, he was also a king who came with his own fair share of shortcomings. He overindulged in food and women and lacked ruthlessness as king. He allowed the Wars of the Roses to drag on and nearly paid the price when he was briefly forced into exile by the returning Henry VI. Edward recovered from this, but he gradually became increasingly unpopular in his own time. 16. Richard I. Another of England's warrior kings. Richard's exploits on the Third Crusade have become legendary. Richard has been accused of neglecting England as he spent such little time in the country during his reign. This isn't entirely fair. During his time as captive to the Holy Roman Emperor, Richard continued to ensure that his kingdom was being governed correctly. However, the ransom paid to release him from captivity placed a huge burden on the English people, and I can't honestly rank Richard any higher. 15. William the Conqueror. A brutal man, William the Conqueror, in my view, likely fabricated his claim that Edward the Confessor had promised him the English crown. When he did become king, William showed himself to be an entirely ruthless and at times heavy handed king. He built castles with stunning frequency across England to ensure subjugation of his new subjects. When their rebellions grew ever more dangerous, he responded in frightening fashion. His massacre of the northern population in 1070 is one of the worst atrocities in the Middle Ages. 14. William II. It may seem controversial that I would rank William II higher than his father, William the Conqueror, but the younger William was, by and large, a relatively decent king. His 13-year-long reign was certainly more peaceful than that of his father's, although there was some considerable animosity between William II and the Church. 13. Edmund Ironside. The rival of King Canute, Edmund, both during and after his father's, Athelred the Unready's reign, fought bravely and defiantly to stop the English crown falling into Danish hands. Ultimately, it was the treachery of another Englishman, Edric Striona, Earl of Mercia, that brought about Edmund's demise. 12. Edward the Confessor. Edward does not get the credit he deserves as king. His 24-year-long reign was a calm and stable one. The biggest issue that Edward had as king was the overbearing Earl Godwin and his sons. The one issue that stains Edward's legacy was the lack of a son and heir that ultimately led to Anglo-Saxon England's downfall. 11. Henry II. Henry was a famously energetic man who travelled at rapid speed, causing huge problems for his retinue, who struggled to keep up. In the early years of his reign, Henry and Chancellor Thomas Becket led England into a period of prosperity. But Henry's decision to make Becket his new Archbishop of Canterbury, the king's explosive temper, and Henry's inability to allow his sons to help govern his vast territories led to a shocking decline in what could have been a truly brilliant reign. Henry's is the most infuriating reign on the list. It could quite easily have been in the top 5. 10. Edmund I. Edmund, reigning from 939 to 946, continued the work of his predecessors in stabilising England, a nation still not yet fully formed. Such was Edmund's good work as king, he earned himself the title Edmund the Magnificent. 9. Canute. Despite his Viking origins, Canute has to be regarded as a great king. Eventually, he would rule over a sizable empire known as the North Sea Empire, with England at the heart of it. At the start of his reign in England, Canute sought to purge the country of potential rivals to his crown and favoured his fellow countrymen in positions of power. Over time, trust began to grow between Canute and the English people as the king bolstered his army with Englishmen as he led campaigns in Scandinavia. 8. Edward III. Edward was a great military leader, as he showed in his wars in France. But as I detailed in a recent video, I do believe his status as a great king has become a little bit overblown because of the Hundred Years' War. Whilst he won some great victories, it is questionable at best to say they left any lasting legacy, and some of Edward's decision making at home during the Black Death would have far reaching and damaging consequences. Nonetheless, it would be remiss of me not to have Edward III at least in the top 10. 7. Henry I. Henry was another king who liked the women, and he sired a ridiculous amount of illegitimate children during his time, but only one legitimate male heir. Henry's reign was a strong one, and he enforced tough laws with brutal punishments, most noted for his use of mutilation. Henry's laws were noted by the barons, who forced the Magna Carta on King John 80 years after Henry's death, stating they wanted England to return to the days of law and order of King Henry I. 6. Edgar the Peaceful. The laws of King Edgar were cited by King Canute over 40 years after the former's death, in both recognition of their value and a desire from Canute to ingratiate himself with the English people. Edgar's reign was unusually calm for the 10th century. Edgar, unlike his son Athelred II, would benefit greatly from a severe drop off in Viking raids, but all the same, his reign ranks up there with the very best in English medieval history. 5. Henry V. Henry V, unlike Edward III earlier in the Hundred Years' War, came genuinely close to bringing France, Europe's great superpower, to its knees. Following on from his famous victory at Agincourt in 1415, Henry was relentless in his pursuit of glory, and in 1420 he forced the French to sign the Treaty of Troyes, which made him heir to the French crown, and also married him to Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the mad French king Charles VI. Stood on the brink of glory, Henry died unexpectedly just weeks before Charles in 1422. How Henry would have managed the English and French crowns we'll never know, but for me, he is one of England's 5 greatest medieval kings. 4. Edward I. Although known as the Hammer of the Scots, Edward I would have been feared equally by those in Wales and anyone stupid enough to make an enemy out of him. Edward was the king who popularised the use of hanging, drawing, and quartering, and forced his enemies in the north, the Scots, to agree an alliance with England's other enemies across the Channel, the French, in an effort to combat the might of the English king. Any joy the Scots had in their wars with England during Edward's reign came when the English king was absent in France, which was no coincidence. Edward breathed his final breath whilst preparing for yet another campaign in Scotland. He was a warrior to the last and a king to be feared. 3. Athelstan. The top 3 in my list are, in my view, without doubt, the most important kings in England's entire history. Without them, the country's history would look entirely different. Athelstan's triumph at the Battle of Brunanburh prevented England from being torn apart by its ravenous enemies, the Vikings and Scots, and is, without doubt, the single most important English victory in battle across the medieval period. 2. Edward the Elder. Aided by his sister, the brilliant Athelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, Edward continued to build on his father's, Alfred the Great's, gains against the Vikings and expanded his kingdom and territories. Whilst his father and his son Athelstan have been given their dues over the centuries, Edward the Elder has often been overlooked, but without him, the reign of Alfred the Great might have counted for very little. 1. Alfred the Great. Although I have made Alfred my number one, I would rank Edward the Elder and Athelstan alongside him. They are three truly remarkable men. The Viking threat was increasing at a rapid pace, and Alfred suffered his fair share of setbacks in battle, but his triumph at the Battle of Edington in 878 brought his kingdom of Wessex some much needed time, and would eventually shift the momentum gradually back into the favour of the Anglo-Saxons. Although Alfred and Edward aren't technically kings of England, they were far too important to leave out. Alfred the Great, Edward the Elder, and Athelstan are England's equivalent of the founding fathers and should be celebrated as such.